Nurse Ariana moved briskly down the hallway of the busy hospital, a stack of patient files clutched in her arms. She always had a smile on her face, even when she felt tired. Everyone knew her for being kind and patient, especially with the elderly. Today, she was assigned to take care of a new patient, Mrs. Thompson, who had just been admitted. Ariana had been told that Mrs. Thompson was an elderly lady who needed special care and attention. As Ariana approached room 202, she took a deep breath and put on her warmest smile. She gently knocked on the door and walked in. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," she greeted cheerfully. Mrs. Thompson was lying in the hospital bed, looking frail but alert. Her silver hair was neatly combed, and she had a soft, kind expression on her face. She turned her head slowly towards Ariana and smiled back. "Good morning, dear. You must be my nurse today." "Yes, I'm Nurse Ariana," Ariana replied. "I'm here to make sure you're comfortable and to take care of you." Ariana started to check Mrs. Thompson's vitals, speaking gently as she worked. "How are you feeling today?" "A little tired, but I'm all right," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "Thank you for asking." As Ariana continued her tasks, the door swung open, and in walked Dr. Allen. He was tall and stern-looking, with a cold expression that seemed permanently etched onto his face. Dr. Allen was known around the hospital for being strict and demanding. He rarely smiled and often criticized the staff, especially the nurses. "Good morning, Dr. Allen." Ariana greeted politely, trying to hide her nervousness. She always felt uneasy around him because he had a reputation for being harsh, especially with the younger and less experienced nurses. Dr. Allen didn't return her greeting. Instead, he walked straight to Mrs. Thompson's bedside and picked up her chart. He glanced at it briefly, then turned to Ariana with a frown. "What's going on here, Nurse Ariana?" he asked in a sharp tone. Ariana felt a pang of anxiety. "I was just checking Mrs. Thompson's vitals and making sure she's comfortable," she explained calmly. Dr. Allen's eyes narrowed as he looked at the equipment Ariana had set up. "This blood pressure monitor is set incorrectly," he snapped, his voice loud and accusatory. "Are you trying to harm the patient?" Ariana felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She quickly checked the monitor and realized she had made a small mistake in setting it up. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Allen." "I'll fix it right away," she said, her voice trembling. But Dr. Allen didn't seem satisfied with her apology. He crossed his arms and raised his voice even more. "This is unacceptable, Nurse Ariana. If you can't do your job properly, you shouldn't be working here. Do you even know what you're doing?" Mrs. Thompson, still lying in the bed, watched the scene with a concerned expression. Ariana glanced at her and felt a lump forming in her throat. She had never felt so embarrassed and humiliated in front of a patient before. Dr. Allen's words cut deep, making her feel small and incapable. "I'm really sorry," Ariana managed to say again, fighting back tears. "It won't happen again." Dr. Allen shook his head angrily. "Sorry isn't good enough. You need to be more careful. This is a hospital, not a playground. People's lives are at stake." He turned to Mrs. Thompson, his tone suddenly changing to one of false politeness. "I apologize for this unprofessional behavior, Mrs. Thompson. I assure you, we will make sure you receive proper care from now on." Mrs. Thompson's eyes softened as she looked at Ariana. "It's all right, doctor. I'm sure Nurse Ariana meant no harm." But Dr. Allen ignored Mrs. Thompson's words. He glared at Ariana again and said, "Get out of this room. I'll handle it from here." Ariana felt her heart sink. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that it was just a small mistake, but the words stuck in her throat. She nodded silently, turned around, and walked out of the room, feeling utterly defeated. As soon as she stepped into the hallway, tears welled up in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away, not wanting anyone to see her crying. Her mind was racing with thoughts. Was she really that bad at her job? Would Dr. Allen report her to the hospital director? Would she lose her position because of a small mistake? Ariana walked to the nearest empty room and sat down, trying to calm herself. She took deep breaths and reminded herself that she loved being a nurse. She loved helping people, making them feel better, and seeing them smile. But now Dr. Allen's harsh words echoed in her mind, making her doubt everything she had worked so hard for. She sat there for a few minutes, trying to regain her composure. She knew she had to go back to work, but the thought of facing Dr. Allen again made her feel sick with fear. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Nurse Emily, her best friend at the hospital. "I heard what happened. Are you okay? Do you want to talk?" Ariana felt a tiny bit of comfort. She knew Emily would understand. She quickly typed a reply. "I'm not okay. Can we talk during lunch?" "Of course," Emily replied. "Stay strong. You're amazing, and don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Ariana took a deep breath. She knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for her patients. She stood up, straightened her uniform, and walked back into the busy hallway, determined to keep going despite the hurt she felt inside. But as she returned to her duties, a question lingered in her mind. Why had Mrs. Thompson been so calm during the whole incident? And what did she mean when she said everything would be okay? The day had started off terribly, but Ariana had a feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. After the humiliating incident with Dr. Allen, Nurse Ariana struggled to shake off a feeling of embarrassment and doubt. She kept replaying the scene in her head, feeling the sting of his harsh words every time. As much as she tried to focus on her work, her mind kept drifting back to the look on Mrs. Thompson's face, the kindness in her eyes as she watched Ariana get scolded. It was as if Mrs. Thompson knew something that no one else did. The next morning, Ariana arrived at the hospital feeling a little better, but still apprehensive. She took a deep breath before stepping inside. The hospital was bustling with activity as usual, with doctors and nurses hurrying around, patients waiting for their appointments, and the faint beeping of monitors echoing the hallways. Ariana forced herself to smile and greet her colleagues, even though she felt like hiding. She could feel the eyes of other staff members on her as she walked down the corridor. A group of nurses whispered quietly, and Ariana caught a few words as she passed by. "Did you hear what happened with Dr. Allen? Poor Ariana. He really went too far this time." Ariana felt a lump in her throat. She hated being the subject of gossip, but it seemed like the entire hospital knew about what had happened. She quickly made her way to the nurses' station, hoping to bury herself in work and avoid any more awkward encounters. As she settled in, Nurse Emily came up to her, her face full of concern. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked gently, placing a comforting hand on Ariana's shoulder. "I'm fine," Ariana lied, trying to sound cheerful, just trying to focus on work. Emily sighed and shook her head. "I heard what happened. Dr. Allen was completely out of line. He shouldn't have spoken to you like that, especially in front of a patient." Ariana shrugged, forcing a smile. "It's okay. I made a mistake, and he was just frustrated, I guess." "That doesn't mean he can treat you like that," Emily said firmly. "You're an amazing nurse, and everyone knows it. Don't let him make you doubt yourself." Ariana nodded, grateful for Emily's support. "Thanks, Emily. I really appreciate it." Emily leaned closer and lowered her voice. "By the way, did you know Mrs. Thompson requested you specifically to be her nurse today?" Ariana's eyes widened in surprise. "What? Are you serious?" Emily nodded. "Yeah," she insisted. "Even when Dr. Allen tried to assign someone else, she says she only wanted you. Isn't that strange?" Ariana felt a mixture of emotions, relief, confusion, and curiosity. Why would she want me after what happened yesterday? Emily shrugged. "I don't know, but it seems like she likes you. Maybe she sees something in you that others don't." Ariana couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mrs. Thompson than met the eye. She remembered the gentle way Mrs. Thompson had looked at her, as if she was watching and understanding everything that was happening. Later that day, Ariana gathered her courage and headed to Mrs. Thompson's room. She knocked gently and walked in, finding the elderly lady sitting up in bed, looking cheerful. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Ariana greeted, feeling a bit nervous. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Thompson replied with a warm smile. "I'm so happy to see you today." "Thank you," Ariana said, feeling a little more at ease. "I was surprised to hear that you requested me." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly. "Yes, I did. I saw what happened yesterday, and I wanted you to know that you're doing a wonderful job. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Ariana felt a wave of gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That means a lot to me." Mrs. Thompson's eyes twinkled. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. Someone who was brave and kind, just like you." Ariana smiled, but before she could ask more, a knock on the door interrupted them. A man in a crisp suit entered the room. He had a serious look on his face, and Ariana noticed the hospital director's badge pinned to his jacket. "Mrs. Thompson, good afternoon," the man greeted with a polite nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Williams," Mrs. Thompson replied, her tone suddenly formal. "Thank you for coming." Ariana stood there, feeling a bit out of place. She glanced at Mrs. Thompson, unsure if she should leave, but Mrs. Thompson gestured for her to stay. "Mr. Williams, I'd like to discuss the incident that happened yesterday," Mrs. Thompson said calmly, her eyes never leaving his. It was deeply upsetting to see such disrespect towards a dedicated nurse. Mr. Williams glanced at Ariana, then back at Mrs. Thompson, his expression serious. "I understand, Mum. We take these matters very seriously. Dr. Allen's behavior was unacceptable, and I assure you, we are looking into it." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her face stern. "Good. I expect you to handle it appropriately. And I want you to know that I will not tolerate any form of discrimination or mistreatment in this hospital." Ariana's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why was Mrs. Thompson so invested in what happened to her? And why was the hospital director himself here to talk to her? Mr. Williams turned to Ariana and spoke gently. "Nurse Ariana, I apologize on behalf of the hospital. You didn't deserve to be treated like that." Ariana felt a lump in her throat and managed to nod. "Thank you," she whispered, still in shock. After Mr. Williams left, Mrs. Thompson turned to Ariana with a knowing smile. "Everything will be all right, dear. Just be patient." Ariana felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and curiosity. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on. Why was Mrs. Thompson so calm and confident, and why did she seem to have so much influence? As Ariana left Mrs. Thompson's room, she noticed more people whispering and glancing her way. The story of Mrs. Thompson's special request was spreading, and everyone was wondering what it meant. But Ariana couldn't focus on the gossip. All she could think about was Mrs. Thompson's mysterious words and the way she seemed to know exactly what was happening. Something big was going on, and Ariana had a feeling that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The hospital seemed to buzz with more energy than usual as Ariana walked through the halls, her mind still whirling from the events of the previous day. She couldn't believe how Mrs. Thompson had spoken up for her, and how the hospital director himself had come to apologize. It felt surreal, and Ariana couldn't help but feel there was more to the story than she understood. After finishing her rounds, Ariana headed to Mrs. Thompson's room, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She took a deep breath and knocked softly on the door before entering. Mrs. Thompson was sitting up in bed, her eyes sparkling as she saw Ariana come in. "Hello, dear," Mrs. Thompson greeted warmly. "I was hoping you would come by." "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Ariana replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "How are you feeling today?" "Oh, I'm feeling quite well," Mrs. Thompson said with a twinkle in her eye. "But I imagine you have a few questions on your mind." Ariana hesitated, not wanting to be rude, but her curiosity got the better of her. "I do, actually. I mean, yesterday was unexpected. You were so kind to me, and I really appreciate it. But why?" Mrs. Thompson chuckled softly. "Because, my dear, you deserved it. But I suppose it's time you learned the whole story." Ariana's curiosity turned into nervous anticipation as she pulled up a chair and sat down beside Mrs. Thompson's bed. The elderly woman looked at her thoughtfully before speaking again. "You see, Ariana, I'm not just any patient here. My full name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm the mother of the man who owns this hospital, she said, watching Ariana's reaction closely. Ariana's eyes widened in shock. The owner of the hospital? You mean Mr. Thompson? Mrs. Thompson nodded. Yes, my son, Robert Thompson, is the owner. He bought this hospital a few years ago, and ever since then, I've made it my mission to visit from time to time to see how things are being run. Ariana was stunned. She had heard of Robert Thompson, of course. He was a well-known businessman and philanthropist, but she had never imagined that Mrs. Thompson was his mother. It all started to make sense now. Why Mrs. Thompson had so much influence, why the hospital director had come personally to apologize, and why Dr. Allen seemed so shaken. I can't believe it, Ariana murmured, still trying to process the information. But why did you choose to stay in a regular room and not in one of the VIP suites? Mrs. Thompson smiled gently. Because I wanted to see how the staff treats all their patients, not just those in the special rooms. I wanted to experience what it's like to be a regular patient, to see if people are being treated with the kindness and respect they deserve. Ariana felt a wave of admiration for Mrs. Thompson. That's incredible. But what about Dr. Allen? What he did yesterday? Mrs. Thompson's expression turned serious. What Dr. Allen did was unacceptable, and I'm not going to let it go unnoticed. No one should be treated the way you were treated, Ariana. No one should feel less than they are because of someone else's arrogance. Ariana's heart swelled with gratitude, but she still felt confused. But why go through all this trouble just for me? Mrs. Thompson leaned forward slightly. Because, Ariana, I've seen how you treat your patients. You care for them, you listen to them, and you make them feel valued. That's exactly the kind of nurse we need more of in this world. And it's certainly the kind of person I want taking care of me. Tears filled Ariana's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. She had always tried to do her best, but she never imagined someone would notice her efforts so deeply. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I didn't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, dear, Mrs. Thompson replied, reaching out to pat Ariana's hand. But there is one more thing I want you to know. Ariana wiped her eyes and looked at Mrs. Thompson, her heart pounding in her chest. What is it? Dr. Allen will be held accountable for his actions, but I also want to use this situation to make things better for everyone. Mrs. Thompson said firmly, I've spoken to my son, and we're going to start a new program in this hospital. A program focused on training staff to treat every patient and colleague with respect, no matter who they are. Ariana's mouth dropped open in surprise. A training program? Yes, Mrs. Thompson continued, and I want you to be a part of it. I want you to help lead it, to share your experiences and help others learn what it means to truly care for people. Ariana felt overwhelmed. This was far beyond anything she had ever expected. Me, lead a training program? I don't know if I can do that. You can. And you will, Mrs. Thompson said with a smile. You have the heart for it, Ariana, and I believe you're exactly what this hospital needs. Ariana sat back, her mind racing. She thought about all the times she had doubted herself, all the moments she had questioned whether she was good enough. And now, here was this incredible opportunity being offered to her by someone who truly believed in her. I don't know what to say, Ariana finally managed. I'm honored, but I'm also scared. It's all right to be scared, dear, Mrs. Thompson said softly, but don't let fear hold you back. You have the strength and the kindness to make a real difference, and I'll be here to support you every step of the way. Ariana felt a surge of determination rise within her. She had always dreamed of making a difference, of helping people beyond just her daily duties as a nurse. Maybe this was her chance to do something truly meaningful. Okay, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I'll do it. I'll help with the program. Mrs. Thompson's face lit up with a proud smile. I knew you would. As Ariana left Mrs. Thompson's room, she felt a sense of purpose she had never felt before. The hospital still buzzed with whispers and gossip. But for the first time in days, she didn't care. She was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that she had the support of someone who believed in her. And as she walked down the hallway, Ariana couldn't help but feel that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The day after her conversation with Mrs. Thompson, Ariana felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety as she walked into the hospital. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, she had been humiliated and made to feel small, and now she was being asked to lead a new program that could change the way everyone in the hospital worked together. She still couldn't fully grasp what was happening, but Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in her mind. You have the strength and the kindness to make a real difference. Ariana's first task was to attend a meeting with the hospital director, Mr. Williams, and Dr. Allen. As she made her way to the meeting room, her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to expect from Dr. Allen. Would he be angry with her for speaking up? Would he try to downplay what happened? When she entered the room, Mr. Williams greeted her warmly. Thank you for coming, Nurse Ariana. Please have a seat. Dr. Allen was already seated, his face unreadable. Ariana felt a flicker of fear, but she reminded herself that she wasn't alone in this. Mrs. Thompson and the hospital's leadership were backing her up. Mr. Williams began the meeting. We're here today to address the incident that occurred a few days ago between Dr. Allen and Nurse Ariana. Mrs. Thompson has expressed serious concerns about what happened, and we need to ensure that our hospital's environment is respectful and supportive for all staff. Dr. Allen cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. I want to start by apologizing, Nurse Ariana. I realized that my behavior was unprofessional and hurtful. I was frustrated. That's no excuse for treating you the way I did. Ariana was taken aback by his apology. It was the first time she had ever seen Dr. Allen look anything but stern and confident. He looked genuinely sorry, and his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. I appreciate your apology, Dr. Allen, Ariana said, her voice steady. It was a difficult situation for me, and I'm glad you're acknowledging it. Mr. Williams nodded approvingly. Thank you, Dr. Allen. I'm glad to see you taking responsibility. Moving forward, we will be implementing a new program to improve communication and respect among our staff, as Mrs. Thompson has suggested. And Nurse Ariana, we would like you to be a key part of this initiative. Dr. Allen looked surprised, but he nodded. I think that's a good idea. We all have things to learn about working together and supporting each other. Ariana couldn't believe what she was hearing. Dr. Allen, the man who had humiliated her, was now willing to participate in a program she would help lead. It was almost too much to take in, but it also filled her with hope. After the meeting, Ariana returned to her duties, her mind still racing. She felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation she had been dreading was over, and she had come out of it stronger. She knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but she was ready to face whatever came next. In the days that followed, Ariana began working with the hospital administration to design the new training program. She met with different departments, listened to their concerns, and shared her own experiences. It was challenging work, and there were moments when she felt overwhelmed, but every time she thought about giving up, she remembered Mrs. Thompson's faith in her. One afternoon, as Ariana was leaving the hospital after a long day of meetings, she saw Mrs. Thompson waiting for her in the lobby, looking as elegant and calm as ever. Hello, dear, Mrs. Thompson greeted her warmly. I've been hearing wonderful things about the progress you're making. Ariana smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. It's been a lot of work, but I think we're making a difference. Mrs. Thompson's eyes sparkled with pride. I knew you would. I'm so proud of you, Ariana. You're doing exactly what I knew you were capable of. Ariana felt tears prick her eyes. I couldn't have done it without your support. You've given me so much strength and encouragement. Mrs. Thompson reached out and gently squeezed Ariana's hand. You had that strength all along, my dear. I just helped you see it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The hospital staff began attending workshops and training sessions focused on teamwork, communication, and respect. Ariana, along with a few other chosen staff members, led discussions and role-playing exercises that helped everyone understand how their words and actions affected others. The atmosphere in the hospital slowly began to change. Nurses and doctors started treating each other with more kindness and understanding. There were still challenges, of course. Old habits are hard to break. But Ariana could see a shift in the way people interacted. It was as if a heavy cloud had lifted, and the hospital felt like a more positive place to work. One morning, as Ariana was preparing for another training session, Dr. Allen approached her. She felt a pang of nervousness, wondering what he wanted to say. "Ariana," he began, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you. This program, it's really opened my eyes. I didn't realize how my behavior affected others. You've helped me see things differently." Ariana was stunned. Dr. Allen, the same doctor who had belittled her, was now thanking her. She felt a swell of pride and humility at the same time. "Thank you, Dr. Allen," she said sincerely. "It means a lot to hear that. I'm glad the program is making a difference." Dr. Allen nodded. "It is. I'm going to keep working on myself. I don't want to be that kind of person anymore." As he walked away, Ariana felt a sense of closure. The person who had once been a source of fear and humiliation for her was now someone who respected her and recognized the value of her work. It was a moment of profound change, not just for her, but for the entire hospital. As the weeks turned into months, the training program continued to grow and evolve. The hospital became known for its positive culture and supportive environment. Patients noticed the change too. They felt the difference in the way they were treated, and it made a huge impact on their experiences. And through it all, Ariana felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had gone through a storm of self-doubt and pain, but she had emerged stronger and more confident. She knew she still had a lot to learn and a lot of work to do, but she was ready. Standing in the hospital lobby one evening, looking around at the place that had become her second home, Ariana felt a surge of gratitude and hope. She had found her voice and her strength, and she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be.